September 9, 1552, Northern Hungary. Captain István Dobó stood on the eastern wall of Eger Castle. A brass telescope pressed to his eye, watching the horizon turn black. It wasn't a storm. It was an army. They came across the plain like a flood. 40,000 men, maybe more. The front group was cavalry. Thousands of horsemen moving in perfect rows, their armor catching the morning sun. Behind them came the foot soldiers, column after column stretching back for miles. And behind them, the siege train. Huge bronze cannons pulled by teams of oxen. Each gun needing 50 men to move it. Dobó lowered the telescope. His hands were steady, but his mind was doing the math that every soldier learns to fear. 2,000 defenders inside these walls. 40,000 coming to kill them. 20 to 1. Captain. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Ferenc Zsolt. Young and trying hard not to sound terrified. What do we do? Dobó turned to face his officers, men he'd trained, fought beside, trusted. They were looking at him the way drowning men look at a rope. We hold, Dobó said quietly. We hold until there's nothing left to hold with. And if they break through, then we make them pay for every inch. Before we go further, let me ask you something. If you like stories like this, real history, real people facing impossible odds, do me a favor. Hit that like button and drop a comment below. It really helps this video reach more people who care about the past. And trust me, you'll want to see how this ends because what happened at Eger in the autumn of 1552 shouldn't have been possible. A group of 800 soldiers, 1,200 regular people, women, children, priests, refugees with nowhere else to run, facing the most powerful military machine on earth. They had 3 months of food if they ate carefully. 42 cannons, most of them cracked or old. Walls that hadn't been tested in a real siege for a generation. And they had István Dobó, a man who had spent 3 years preparing for a battle everyone said would never come. It came. Dobó walked along the wall, past soldiers checking their muskets, past women carrying ammunition from the weapons storage, past children too young to understand what was about to happen. He stopped at the southern tower and looked out at the approaching army. Somewhere in that mass of steel and silk was the Ottoman commander, a man named Ali Pasha, a veteran of a dozen sieges, a man who had never failed to take a fortress. Dobó had read the reports. He knew what Ali Pasha did to cities that resisted. He knew about the slaves, the executions, the heads put on spikes as warnings. He knew, and he stayed anyway. Send word to every station, Dobó said. All civilians to the inner keep. All soldiers to their positions. No one fires until I give the order. Sir, should we try to negotiate? Dobó looked at Zsolt. The boy was 19, the son of a Budapest merchant, barely old enough to shave. There's nothing to negotiate, Dobó said. They want this castle. We won't give it to them. So we're going to teach them what it costs to take something from Hungarians. He turned and walked toward the command tower, his boots echoing on stone that had stood for 200 years. In 6 weeks, that stone would be covered in blood. In 6 weeks, the name Eger would be carved into history. But on this morning, all István Dobó did was watch the empire come to swallow him whole and decide again as he decided every day for 3 years that he would not run. The Ottoman army reached the edge of cannon range and stopped. 40,000 men waiting, 2,000 souls refusing to break. The siege was about to begin. To understand what Dobó was facing, you need to understand what the Ottoman Empire had become by 1552. This wasn't some messy group of tribes. This was the most advanced military power on the planet. An empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the gates of Vienna, from the deserts of Arabia to the Danube River. At its head sat Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, and the title wasn't propaganda. He'd been on the throne for 32 years and hadn't stopped conquering. 1521, Belgrade fell, the gateway to Hungary, captured after a 3-week siege. 1522, Rhodes fell. The Knights Hospitaller, who'd held the island for 2 centuries, gave up after 6 months of bombing. 1526, Mohawks. The Hungarian army met Suleiman in open battle and was destroyed. 20,000 Hungarians dead in 2 hours. King Louis II drowned, running from the battlefield. The kingdom shattered. 1541, Buda fell. The capital of Hungary taken over. The country split into 3 pieces. Ottoman territory in the south, Habsburg-controlled west, and a narrow strip of independent Hungarian kingdoms in between. Eger sat in that strip, a fortress town on the border, the last major stronghold before the road to Vienna. If Eger fell, the Ottomans would have a clear path north. The Habsburg Empire would be next, then the German states, then the rest of Europe. No pressure. But the Ottomans didn't conquer through numbers alone. They conquered through new ideas, discipline, and a military system that turned war into science. Their cannons were the largest in the world, made in bronze by master craftsmen in Constantinople, carved with Quranic verses, and able to throw 300-pound stone balls through fortress walls. Their cavalry was legendary. Sipahi riders in layered armor who could fire a bow at full speed and hit a target 100 yards away. Their engineers could build bridges across rivers in hours, dig tunnels under walls, build siege towers that rose higher than church steeples. And then there were the Janissaries. The Janissaries were the nightmare Europe whispered about. They were Christian boys taken as tribute from conquered villages across the Balkans, taken from their families at age 7 or 8, brought to Constantinople, converted to Islam, and trained. The training was harsh by design. The boys learned to fight, to shoot, to handle pain without flinching. They were beaten for weakness, starved for discipline, drilled until following orders was automatic. By the time they were 16, they weren't boys anymore. They were weapons. They wore special uniforms, long robes, tall white felt hats, curved swords at their belts. They carried matchlock muskets and knew how to use them. They moved in formation, fought in silence, and showed no mercy. They were forbidden to marry, forbidden to own property, forbidden any loyalty except to the Sultan. And they were terrifyingly good at what they did. The Janissaries were the first modern standing army in Europe, says Dr. Laszlo Nagy, professor of military history at Yavuz-Lorand University. They were professionals in an age of feudal armies. They trained year-round. They fought as units, not individuals. A European knight might be brave, but he was one man. A Janissary was part of a machine. By 1552, there were 40,000 Janissaries in the Ottoman military. Ali Pasha brought 10,000 of them to Eger. The Ottomans didn't just attack fortresses, they carefully took them apart. The process was improved over centuries, a formula used on city after city. Step 1. Surround the target. Cut off all supply lines. No food in, no messengers out. Mental isolation. Step 2. Bombardment. Place the cannons just outside musket range and fire day and night until the walls crack. The goal wasn't to break through immediately. It was to break spirits to make the defenders understand that fighting back was useless. Step 3. Mining. While the cannons fired, engineers dug tunnels beneath the walls. They'd hold up the tunnels with wooden beams, filled the space with gunpowder, then light the fuse and collapse entire sections of wall. Step 4. Attack. Once a hole opened, send in the Janissaries. Wave after wave, climbing over their own dead if necessary until the defenders were beaten. Step 5. Take over or kill everyone depending on how long the city fought back. It worked. It always worked. In 1543, the Ottomans besieged Székesfehérvár, the ancient coronation city of Hungarian kings. The garrison held for 17 days. Then the walls fell. Every defender was killed. In 1544, they took Visegrad. 8 days. Same result. In 1548, they took Temesvar. The siege lasted a month. When it was over, the Ottoman commander had the Hungarian officers skinned alive and their skins stuffed with straw as trophies. The message was clear. Give up early, live, fight back, and suffer. Eger knew the message. Eger chose to fight back anyway because by 1552 Hungary had run out of places to run to. Every fortress lost was another knife in the country's heart. Every city given up was another 1,000 families made slaves. Someone had to draw a line. István Dobó decided that line would be drawn at Eger even if it killed him. István Dobó was born in 1502 in the village of Ruska in the Carpathian foothills. He wasn't nobility. His father was a minor landholder, a man who owned a few fields and a stone house and not much else. Dobó grew up working the land, learning to ride, learning to shoot, learning the skills every Hungarian boy learned because the border was always dangerous. When he was 16, Ottoman raiders swept through Ruska. They came at night, burning homes, stealing animals, dragging villagers away in chains. Dobó's father grabbed a sword and ran into the street. He killed one raider before a curved sword took his head off. Dobó and his younger brother hid in a root cellar while their house burned above them. They survived. Their father didn't. Their home didn't. Dobó walked to the nearest garrison town the next morning and joined the army. He was 17 years old, half-starved and filled with the kind of cold anger that doesn't fade. Dobó was shaped by loss, says historian Dr. Katalin Peter. He knew what the Ottomans did to the people they conquered. He'd seen it. He'd lived it. That made him different from nobles who fought for honor or glory. Dobó fought because he understood what was at stake on a personal level. He rose through the ranks not because of connections, but because he was good at what he did. He learned tactics by studying battles, by reading Roman military books, by making mistakes and surviving them. He learned how to lead men by earning their respect, not demanding it. By his mid-30s, Dobó was a captain in the Hungarian border forces, the Végvári, the frontier soldiers who held the line against constant Ottoman raids. It was brutal, grinding work, fights in the hills, night raids, ambushes, the kind of warfare where survival was measured in days, not years. Dobó was good at it. In 1549, King Ferdinand I of Hungary needed someone to command the garrison at Eger Castle. The previous commander had died of fever. Most officers saw Eger as a dead-end posting, isolated, underfunded, strategically weak. Dobó saw it as important. He accepted the assignment. Dobó arrived at Eger in the spring of 1549 and immediately started preparing for a siege no one thought would come. He strengthened the walls with earthworks, making them wider to absorb cannon fire. He stored up grain, gunpowder, and cannonballs. He trained the garrison over and over, not just in shooting, but in close combat, in how to hold a hole in the wall, in how to fight when everything goes to hell. He recruited local men as militia. He organized the civilians, teaching them how to carry ammunition, how to put out fires, how to stay calm when the world was exploding around them. His officers thought he was paranoid. He was preparing. Then in August 1552, the news came. Buda had strengthened its Ottoman garrison. Suleiman had sent a huge army north under Ali Pasha. Their target, Eger. The Hungarian High Command sent Dobó orders. Leave the castle. Pull back to safer territory. Don't waste men defending a position that couldn't be held. Dobó read the orders in his command chamber alone, staring at the words for a long time. Then he burned the letter. Dobó understood something the High Command didn't, says Dr. Nagy. Every fortress they gave up made the next one harder to defend. If you keep running back, eventually you run out of ground. Somebody had to stop running. He called his officers together and told them the truth. We've been ordered to leave. I'm refusing the order. Anyone who wants to leave can do so now with no shame. But I'm staying. This castle stands, or I die in its rubble. Silence. Then Lieutenant Zult spoke. I'll stay. Then another officer, and I. Then another. By the end of the meeting, every officer had promised to stay. 800 soldiers, 1,200 civilians, refugees who'd run from burned villages, families who had nowhere else to go, priests and merchants and farmers who'd come to Eger because it was supposed to be safe. Dobó made them a promise. I won't lie to you. The odds are against us. The Ottomans are stronger, better armed, and they have 40,000 men. But we have these walls. We have each other. And we have something they don't, a reason to fight that goes beyond orders. This is our land, our home. If they want it, they'll have to bury us under it. The civilians listened. Some cried. Some prayed. None of them left. By late August, the roads leading to Eger were packed with refugees. They came from the villages to the south, Mezőkovszk, Kopolna, places the Ottoman front line had already reached. Smoke rose from the horizon every day. At night, you could see the glow of burning homes. The refugees arrived with whatever they could carry. Wagons piled with grain sacks and family treasures. Children holding dolls, old men leaning on walking sticks, eyes blank with shock. Eger opened its gates and let them in. Among the refugees was a woman named Eva Cici. She was 34, the widow of a Hungarian cavalry officer who died at the Battle of Mohacs 26 years earlier. She'd raised their son, Mihai, alone, running a small estate outside Mezőkovszk. She was educated, could read and write, and had a reputation for being stubborn as iron. When the Ottoman scouts appeared on her land, her neighbors told her to run north to the safer Habsburg territories. Eva refused. If I run, she told her son, where does it stop? How many times do we leave our homes before we decide to defend them? She loaded her wagon with supplies, brought her 15-year-old son, and joined the group heading to Eger. Also among the refugees was a young man named György Bornemisza. He was 22, a clerk working for a minor nobleman. He had soft hands, no combat training, and a nervous habit of fixing his glasses when he was worried, which was often. He'd come to Eger because he had nowhere else to go. When the refugees entered the castle courtyard, Dobó was there to meet them. He stood on a wooden platform and spoke to the crowd. You're safe here. We'll feed you, shelter you, and protect you. But I need you to understand something. This castle is going to be attacked. The Ottomans are coming, and when they arrive, nowhere inside these walls will be completely safe. If you want to leave, go now. But if you stay as part of this garrison. We'll need every hand. Eva stepped forward. We'll stay and we'll fight. Dobó looked at her, this sharp-eyed woman with dirt on her dress and steel in her voice. Can you load a musket? He asked. Teach me. Dobó made a decision that would define the siege. He armed the civilians. Not all of them. Children and the elderly were given safer jobs, carrying water and helping the wounded, but anyone who could lift a weapon was trained to use it. The men were formed into backup units assigned to repair walls, carry ammunition, and help the regular soldiers during attacks. The women were organized into support crews, making food, managing supplies, caring for the injured. But some of the women wanted more. Eva Cici went to Dobó directly. We're not asking to stand on the front line, she said. But if the walls are broken, if the soldiers fall, we need to know how to defend ourselves. Give us weapons. Teach us to fight. Dobó hesitated. It wasn't that he doubted their courage. It was that he'd seen what happened in sieges. He'd seen what the Ottomans did to women captured in fallen cities. But Eva didn't back down. We know the risks, Captain. We'd rather die fighting than wait to be taken. Dobó nodded slowly. All right, report to the weapons storage at dawn. Over the next 2 weeks, Eger changed. Women learned to load and fire matchlock muskets. They practiced carrying heavy pots of boiling water to the walls. They were taught to recognize the sound of tunneling beneath the foundations, to watch for siege towers, to stay low when arrows filled the sky. György Bornemisza, the nervous clerk, signed up to help dig defensive trenches. He'd never done manual labor in his life. His hands got blisters and bled. He kept digging. Children were given the job of carrying stones to the walls, ammunition for when the defenders ran out of everything else. The elderly made bandages, sharpened blades, and kept the kitchens running. The castle became a single living thing, every person a vital part. Dobó walked the walls every evening watching his people work. He saw Eva Cici practicing with a musket, her jaw set in focus. He saw Bornemisza stumbling under the weight of a basket of rubble, refusing help. He saw soldiers teaching farmers how to hold a spear, how to stand in formation, how to trust the man beside you. And he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not that they would win. He was too experienced to believe that, but hoped that whatever happened, these people would not go quietly. On September 8, 1552, the last refugee group arrived. The gates were sealed. The watchtowers reported movement on the southern horizon. Dobó stood on the eastern wall, looking out at the empty plain, and waited. The next morning, the horizon turned black. The Ottomans had arrived. The siege begins. Cannons, janissaries, and blood. The Ottoman force that surrounded Eger in September 1552 was commanded by two experienced military leaders, Ali Pasha, the Pasha of Buda, and Kara Ahmed Pasha. Ali Pasha had served in multiple battles across the Ottoman Empire. He had taken part in sieges in Persia, led military operations in the Balkans, and ran Ottoman-controlled Hungary from his base in Buda. He was careful, patient, and used to winning. Historical records suggest that Ali Pasha did not at first see Eger as a big challenge. The fortress was isolated, lightly defended, and cut off from help. Ottoman intelligence guessed the garrison at fewer than 1,000 soldiers. By comparison, Ali Pasha commanded about 40,000 troops, including 10,000 janissaries, 15,000 provincial cavalry, and large groups of engineers, diggers, and artillery experts. The Ottoman siege train included heavy bronze cannons able to fire stone projectiles weighing up to 300 pounds. These guns had destroyed fortress walls across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. Ottoman siege methods in this period were highly developed, explains Dr. Gabor Agostin, professor of history at Georgetown University and expert in Ottoman military history. They didn't rush. They carefully isolated the target, destroyed its defenses through bombing and tunneling, then beat it through coordinated attack. The process had been improved over centuries. On September 10, 1552, Ali Pasha sent a messenger to the gates of Eger under a flag of truce. The message was standard Ottoman procedure. Give up the fortress immediately, and the garrison would be allowed safe passage. Refuse, and face total destruction. István Dobó's response, written down in Hungarian chronicles from that time, was short. The fortress would not surrender. The messenger returned to the Ottoman camp. Ali Pasha gave the order to begin bombing. On September 11, 1552, the Ottoman artillery opened fire. The sound was unlike anything most of the defenders had experienced. The heavy cannons made a deep, earth-shaking boom that could be heard for miles. The projectiles, huge stone balls, screamed through the air and hit the castle walls with devastating force. When a 300-pound stone ball hits a medieval wall, the impact creates shock waves that spread through the stone. Mortar cracks, stones shift, entire sections of wall can fall inward. The Ottomans placed their heavy guns about 800 yards from the castle, just beyond the reach of Eger's lighter defensive cannons. This allowed them to bomb the walls with relative safety. The Hungarian guns at Eger were mostly smaller, good for fighting people, but not for firing back at that distance, notes Colonel Gazza Purges. Dobó couldn't silence the Ottoman guns. All he could do was take the punishment and repair the damage as quickly as possible. The bombing continued day and night. Ottoman gunners worked in shifts, keeping a steady rhythm of fire designed to wear down both the walls and the defenders' spirits. Historical accounts describe the mental toll. The constant noise made sleep impossible. Dust filled the air. Defenders developed what modern soldiers would recognize as shell shock, a numb, exhausted state caused by long exposure to artillery fire. But the walls held. Dobó had prepared for this. The earthwork walls he'd built behind the stone walls absorbed much of the energy from the cannon balls. When sections of stone crumbled, work crews immediately filled the gaps with wood, rubble, and packed earth. The Ottomans fired hundreds of rounds in the first week alone. The outer walls showed damage, but no major holes opened. Ali Pasha changed his plan. If the cannons alone wouldn't break the fortress, he would combine bombing with direct attack. On September 16, 1552, the first major attack began. Shortly after dawn on September 16, Ottoman drums began to beat. The sound was rhythmic, constant, and meant to be scary. Thousands of janissaries gathered in formation outside the castle walls, organized into attack columns. They carried scaling ladders, long wooden structures designed to hook onto the top of walls. They wore minimal armor, padded tunics, small round shields, helmets, choosing speed over protection. They were armed with curved swords, daggers, and matchlock muskets. According to Georgely Bornemissa's eyewitness account written after the siege, the Janissaries moved forward in near silence except for the drums. No war cries, no shouting, just thousands of men moving forward in disciplined lines. This was psychological warfare, says Dr. Caroline Finkel. The silence was more frightening than screaming. It showed discipline, confidence, and that victory was certain. The message was clear. You cannot stop this. The Hungarian defenders waited on the walls, matchlocks loaded, cannons ready with grapeshot. István Dobó reportedly gave the order to hold fire until the attackers were within 50 yards. When the Janissaries reached that distance, the walls exploded. Eger's cannons fired at the same time, loaded with anti-personnel rounds, canvas bags filled with dozens of iron balls that scattered like deadly hail. Muskets cracked in messy volleys. Crossbowmen released bolts. The front rows of the Ottoman attack fell, but the men behind them kept coming. Janissary tactics relied on accepting deaths to close the distance, explains Colonel Purges. They knew the first wave would be cut down, but if enough men reached the walls, they could get a foothold. Their numbers would do the rest. The Janissaries reached the base of the walls and threw up their ladders. Dozens of ladders slammed against the stone walls. Soldiers began climbing. The Hungarian defenders met them at the top. Medieval siege warfare, especially fighting on ladders and walls, was brutal in ways modern warfare is not. When a Janissary reached the top of a ladder, he had to pull himself over the wall while Hungarian defenders stuck spears at his face, swung axes at his hands, or simply pushed the ladder backward. Men fell screaming. Ladders fell over, taking multiple soldiers down with them. Bodies began to pile at the base of the walls, but the Janissaries kept climbing. Historical records show that women played a direct combat role during this attack. Groups of civilian women, organized by Eva Sisi and others, carried heavy pots of boiling water to the walls. When Ottoman soldiers gathered at the base of ladders or tried to force their way through arrow slits, the women poured the scalding liquid down on them. The effect was terrible. Boiling water causes immediate, agonizing burns. Soldiers hit by it would drop their weapons, stumble, and fall. Those who survived were often blinded or so badly burned they couldn't keep fighting. The use of boiling liquids in siege defense was common in this period, notes Dr. Agustin. What made Eger unusual was the scale and organization. Dobó had stored up huge amounts of water, oil, and rendered fats specifically for this purpose. And he trained civilians, including women, to deliver it under fire. The attack lasted about 4 hours. Wave after wave of Janissaries charged the walls. Wave after wave was pushed back. By mid-morning, the base of Eger's eastern wall was covered with hundreds of Ottoman dead and wounded. Ali Pasha called off the attack. The Janissaries pulled back in good order, carrying their wounded and leaving their dead where they lay. On the walls, Hungarian defenders stared at the destruction below. They had held, but the cost was becoming clear. Casualty reports showed 47 defenders killed, 80 wounded. For a garrison that started with only 800 soldiers, those were losses they couldn't replace. And everyone knew this was just the beginning. That night, Dobó walked the walls, speaking quietly to his soldiers, checking on the wounded and looking at damage. According to Bornemissa, Dobó told his officers, "Today we learned they can be stopped. Tomorrow we prove we can do it again." But Ali Pasha was already changing tactics. If direct attack wouldn't work, he would go under the walls instead of over them. Mining was one of the most feared siege tactics of the 16th century. The process was careful. Ottoman engineers would pick a section of wall, then begin digging a tunnel toward it from a spot outside the defender's musket range. The tunnel would be held up with wooden beams as it moved forward. Once the tunnel reached the foundation of the wall, the miners would dig a large chamber directly beneath the stone. They would pack this chamber with barrels of gunpowder, lay a slow-burning fuse, and pull back. When the powder exploded, the foundation would collapse, bringing down the wall above it. Mining was incredibly effective against medieval fortifications, says Dr. Nagy. Stone walls are strong against weight from above. They can support huge weight, but they're weak to having their foundations removed. Once the ground beneath them gives way, they collapse. The challenge for defenders was finding it and responding. Dobó used a technique that had been used since ancient times. Water-filled bowls placed on the ground inside the castle. When Ottoman miners dug beneath the walls, the shaking would cause ripples in the water. Watchers checked these bowls constantly. When ripples appeared, they could guess the approximate location of the enemy tunnel. The counter tactic was called counter-mining. Dig your own tunnel toward the enemy tunnel, break through, and either collapse it or fight the miners underground. It was tight, terrifying work. In late September, Hungarian watchers detected mining activity beneath the eastern tower. Dobó ordered counter-mining teams to start work. György Bornemisza volunteered for one of these teams. Counter-mining operations were done by small teams, usually 4 to 6 men working in shifts. They dug through earth and rock using picks, shovels, and their hands. The tunnels were barely wide enough for a man to crawl through. Wooden beams were placed every few feet to prevent cave-ins. The only light came from oil lamps which used up precious oxygen in the tight space. The air was thick, hot, and hard to breathe. Men worked in near total darkness, listening for sounds of enemy digging on the other side of the earth. According to historical accounts, Bornemisza's team broke into an Ottoman tunnel on September 24. What followed was close combat in conditions almost impossible to imagine. The tunnels were too narrow to swing a sword. Men fought with daggers, picks, and their hands. There was no room to move around, no retreat. It was kill or be killed in total darkness, breathing air thick with dust and smoke. Bornemisza's account describes the fight in sparse, traumatized language. He wrote that the fighting lasted only minutes, but felt like hours. Men screamed. Someone's lamp fell and went out. He stabbed a man he couldn't see, felt the body go limp, and kept stabbing until he was certain the threat was dead. The Hungarians managed to drive the Ottoman miners back, then filled the enemy tunnel with barrels of rubble and collapsed it using a small explosive charge. The blast shook the entire castle. Dust shot up through cracks in the courtyard. For a moment, everyone feared the walls were coming down. But when the dust cleared, the eastern tower still stood. The Ottoman tunnel had been stopped. Bornemisza came out of the tunnel covered in mud and blood, temporarily deaf from the explosion, shaking uncontrollably. Eva Sisi, who had been organizing women to carry rubble for the counter-mining operations, found him sitting against a wall, staring at nothing. She brought him water and sat beside him in silence. No words were needed. Over the next 2 weeks, Ottoman engineers tried 4 more mining operations. Each time, Hungarian counter-miners found and stopped them, but the strain was beginning to show. The garrison was running low on gunpowder. Food portions had been cut. Casualties continued to grow. Ali Pasha meanwhile was growing frustrated. 3 weeks into the siege, Eger still stood. He ordered another major attack, this time with everything he had. By early October, the firewomen, when civilians became killers. The siege had settled into a brutal routine. Daily bombing, regular attacks, tunneling and counter-tunneling, constant losses. Supplies inside Eger were running low. Gunpowder reserves were down to 1/3 of what they started with. Food portions had been cut to bare minimum levels. Medical supplies were almost gone. The wounded filled the castle's chapel, which had been turned into a temporary hospital. Civilian women cared for injuries with limited bandages, no pain medicine, and nothing but prayer for infection. Spirit remained high, but everyone understood the math. Every casualty weakened the defense. Every used barrel of gunpowder brought them closer to being helpless. On October 3, the Ottomans launched their largest attack yet. This time, Ali Pasha sent nearly 15,000 troops at the same time, attacking multiple sections of the wall at once to spread the defenders thin. The attack began at dawn with an increased bombing. Ottoman cannons fired for 2 hours straight, focusing on the eastern and southern walls. Then the drums began. Thousands of Janissaries moved forward, carrying ladders, shields locked overhead to protect against arrow fire. They were supported by provincial troops, Anatolian foot soldiers armed with spears and swords who rushed forward in a human wave designed to beat the defenders through sheer numbers. The Hungarian garrison was stretched to the breaking point. Dobó had about 500 able-bodied soldiers left. He placed them along 600 yards of wall. The math was impossible. So the civilians stepped in. Historical sources, particularly Bornemissa's account, are clear about the role women played during the October 3rd attack. Groups of women led by Eva Sisi and others formed fire teams. They heated huge pots of water, oil, and animal fat to boiling temperatures, then carried them, often under direct enemy fire, to sections of the wall where Ottoman troops were trying to climb. When Janissaries reached the top of their ladders, the women poured the boiling liquid directly onto them. The results were horrible. Men fell screaming, their skin peeling off. Those who survived were often blinded or so badly burned they went into shock. But the tactic worked. It broke attack after attack. The women of Eger weren't just supporting the defense. They were fighters, says Dr. Peter. They were killing enemy soldiers, and they were doing it at huge personal risk. Ottoman archers specifically targeted them once they realized what was happening. One recorded incident describes a woman named Unknown who was hit by an arrow while carrying a pot to the wall. She fell, spilling the boiling oil, which badly burned 2 other women nearby. All 3 died within hours, but the attacks continued. Another documented event involves a woman who was grabbed by a Janissary who had reached the top of the wall. According to accounts, he tried to pull her over the wall as he fell backward off his ladder. She went over the edge and fell 30 feet to her death on the rocks below. The violence was total. There were no safe positions. No one was safe from danger. By midday, the eastern wall was slick with blood, oil, and debris. Bodies, Ottoman and Hungarian alike, lay piled at the base. The air reeked of gunpowder, burning flesh, and death. But the walls held. At about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Ali Pasha called off the attack. The Ottomans had suffered huge casualties. Estimates suggest over 2,000 killed or wounded in a single day. Eger's losses were also severe. 93 defenders dead, over 100 wounded. That night, Eva Sisi sat alone on the steps of the chapel, staring at her hands. They were badly burned from handling hot pots. The skin was blistered and peeling. According to Bornemissa, she cried, not from pain, but from exhaustion and the weight of what she had done and seen. Dobó found her there. He said nothing. He simply sat beside her. After a long silence, Sisi reportedly asked, "How much longer can we last?" Dobó's response, as recorded by Bornemissa, "As long as we must." But privately, Dobó knew the truth. Eger was running out of time. By mid-October, István Dobó faced a critical problem. His garrison was exhausted. Ammunition was running dangerously low. Food supplies were almost gone. The Ottoman bombing had created multiple weak points in the walls that could not be fully repaired. He couldn't win through strength. The Ottomans still outnumbered him 20-1, but he could win through trickery. Dobó ordered a series of carefully planned measures designed to convince the Ottomans that Eger was stronger than it actually was. First, he had his soldiers do false troop movements at night. Small groups of men would march past torches in repeating loops, creating the illusion of reinforcements arriving from the north. Second, he ordered all remaining cannons to fire coordinated volleys at regular times throughout the night, not at specific targets, but simply to make noise and create the impression of a well-supplied arsenal. Third, he had the garrison sing loudly. War hymns, folk songs, anything that showed confidence and defiance. The singing could be heard across the valley, reaching the Ottoman camp. This was psychological operations in the 16th century, says Dr. Nagy. Dobó understood that Ali Pasha was making decisions based on intelligence reports and observations. If he could change those observations, he could influence Ottoman decision-making. The strategy worked. Ottoman scouts reported back to Ali Pasha that the fortress appeared to have received reinforcements. The amount of cannon fire suggested adequate supplies. The singing indicated high spirits. By late October, Ali Pasha was facing his own crisis. The siege had dragged on for over a month. He had lost thousands of men. His supply lines were stretched. Winter was coming, and fighting in the Hungarian highlands during winter was a logistical nightmare. Moreover, his reputation was at stake. He had promised the Sultan that Eger would fall quickly. Instead, it had become a drawn-out, costly stalemate. Ottoman military records preserved in the archives in Istanbul show that Ali Pasha sent messages back to Constantinople asking for additional troops and supplies. But he also knew that reinforcements would take weeks to arrive, and every day the siege continued, his position weakened. There was another factor: Hungarian relief forces. Throughout October, there were constant rumors that a Hungarian relief army was being put together in the north. Ottoman scouts reported troop movements. Cavalry patrols clashed with Hungarian outriders. The rumors were partly true. King Ferdinand had authorized the formation of a relief column, but internal political arguments and lack of money had delayed its departure. By mid-October, the relief force still hadn't left Bratislava. But Ali Pasha didn't know that. From his perspective, he was potentially facing a two-front battle, the stubborn fortress in front of him and a relief army coming from behind. On October 12, he made a decision. One final, overwhelming attack. Send every available soldier. If Eger fell, the campaign would be saved. If it didn't, he would pull back before winter and before any relief force could arrive. The date was set, October 17, 1552. The final assault, 39 days that changed Europe. Every soldier in the Ottoman camp knew it. This would be the deciding battle. In Eger, Hungarian scouts watched the preparations, the gathering of troops, the piling up of ladders and siege equipment, the movement of artillery into closer positions. Dobó called his officers together and told them the truth. The next attack would be total. The Ottomans would throw everything at the walls. If the defense broke anywhere, the castle would fall. He gave his final orders. Every able-bodied person, soldier or civilian, man or woman, would fight. There would be no reserves, no fallback positions, hold the walls or die trying. On the night of October 16, the defenders of Eger prepared for the end. October 17, 1552. Dawn. The Ottoman bombing began at first light and was unlike anything that had come before. Every cannon in the siege train fired at the same time. The noise was continuous, overwhelming, a physical force that made the ground shake and the air vibrate. For 2 hours, the cannons pounded the walls without pause. Sections of the eastern wall collapsed. The southern tower cracked along its foundation. Dust and smoke filled the air so thickly that you could only see a few yards. Then suddenly the cannons stopped. In the silence that followed, the drums began. According to multiple historical accounts, about 25,000 Ottoman troops attacked Eger at the same time on the morning of October 17. The attack came from all sides. Janissaries stormed the eastern wall. Provincial infantry attacked the south. Cavalry got off their horses and moved forward on the western gates with battering rams. It was total war. The defenders met them with everything they had left. Cannons loaded with grapeshot fired point-blank into the mass of troops. Musketeers fired, reloaded, fired again until their barrels were too hot to touch. Women threw stones, poured boiling oil, swung makeshift weapons at anyone who reached the top of the walls. The fighting was savage and chaotic. Ottoman soldiers broke through the outer wall in 3 places. Janissaries poured through, clashing with Hungarian defenders in hand-to-hand combat in the narrow courtyards. Dobó personally led a counterattack into the largest hole in the wall. Armed with a sword and joined by about 50 soldiers, he charged directly into the mass of Janissaries trying to secure the gap. Contemporary accounts describe Dobó fighting with desperate fury, cutting down multiple opponents, rallying his men by sheer force of will. The counterattack succeeded in clearing the breach temporarily, but at huge cost. Half of Dobó's men were killed or wounded in the fight. By mid-morning, the defense was collapsing. Ottoman troops held positions inside the outer courtyard. The southern tower was on the verge of falling. Ammunition was almost gone. Casualties were catastrophic. György Bornemisza's account describes this moment as the point when everyone believed the end had come. But then something unexpected happened. The Ottoman attack began to lose momentum. After 4 hours of continuous fighting, even the disciplined Janissaries were exhausted. They had taken huge casualties. The bodies of their comrades filled the holes and courtyards. Every step forward cost dozens of lives. And the Hungarians refused to break. No matter how many times the Ottomans pushed forward, they met resistance. No matter how many defenders fell, others took their place. What happened at Eger during that final attack is almost impossible to explain from a military standpoint, says Colonel Purges. By all logical calculation, the defense should have collapsed, but spirit, leadership, and sheer willpower kept it standing just long enough for the Ottoman attack to wear itself out. Around noon, Ali Pasha ordered a temporary pullback to regroup. The Ottomans pulled back, dragging their wounded with them. The defenders used the pause to frantically rebuild barriers using corpses, furniture, rubble, anything available. 2 hours later, the Ottomans attacked again. This time, the attack was less coordinated, less disciplined. The troops were tired. Their officers struggled to keep formation. The defense held. By late afternoon, the Ottoman attacks had turned into scattered, disorganized charges that were pushed back with relative ease. At sunset, Ali Pasha called off the attack completely. The Ottomans pulled back to their camp. On the walls of Eger, the defenders stood among the dead and dying, too exhausted to cheer, too numb to feel relief. They had survived barely. The night of October 17th was quiet. No bombing, no drums, just silence. Inside Eger, the survivors counted their losses. Of the original 800 soldiers, fewer than 300 remained able to fight. Over 200 civilians had been killed. The wounded filled every available space. The castle was a ruin. Walls had collapsed. Buildings had burned. The courtyards were filled with debris and corpses. But the fortress had not fallen. Over the next 2 days, Hungarian scouts watched activity in the Ottoman camp. Tents were being taken down. Wagons were being loaded. Troops were forming into marching columns. On October 18th, the impossible became reality. The Ottoman army pulled back. Ali Pasha, facing losses he couldn't replace, shrinking supplies, approaching winter, and reports of a potential relief force, made the decision to lift the siege. 40,000 troops marched south, leaving behind their dead and their failure. On the morning of October 19th, lookouts on Eger's walls confirmed what seemed unbelievable. The Ottomans were gone. The siege was over. Eger had held. On the evening of October 17th, 1552, Ali Pasha sat in his command tent and faced a reality that no Ottoman commander wanted to face. He had lost, not in a single terrible battle, but through slow, grinding losses against an opponent that refused to accept the inevitable. The casualty reports were devastating. Ottoman losses during the siege are estimated at between 8,000 and 10,000 men killed or wounded. The October 17th attack alone had cost roughly 2,000 casualties. These weren't just numbers. They were Janissaries, elite troops that took years to train and could not be easily replaced. They were experienced soldiers, siege engineers, artillerymen. For the Ottoman military system, losing 10,000 men wasn't strategically crippling, explains Dr. Agostin. The empire could absorb those losses, but losing them for nothing, failing to take a minor fortress, that was a political and mental disaster. Ali Pasha's supply situation was equally terrible. The siege train had used huge amounts of gunpowder. Food supplies for 40,000 men, even with regular resupply groups, were running low, and winter was coming. Fighting in the Hungarian highlands after October was logistically nightmarish. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Roads turned to mud. Supply lines became unreliable. There was also the constant threat of Hungarian relief forces. While Ali Pasha's scouts had not confirmed the arrival of a major relief army, reports showed troop movements to the north. The possibility of being caught between a fortified position and a field army was a scenario no commander wanted. On October 18, Ali Pasha gathered his senior officers. Ottoman military records preserved in the Topkapi Palace archives in Istanbul include references to this meeting. While the exact details of the discussion are not recorded, the outcome is clear. Ali Pasha ordered a general pullback. The decision was logical from a military standpoint, but it carried big consequences. Ali Pasha had promised Sultan Suleiman that Eger would fall quickly. Instead, the siege had dragged on for 39 days and ended in failure. Pulling back from Eger was a humiliation, says Dr. Finkel. Not just for Ali Pasha personally, but for the Ottoman military establishment. They had thrown overwhelming force at a minor fortress and been defeated by a garrison that on paper shouldn't have lasted a week. The pullback began immediately. Ottoman engineers took apart the siege works. Artillery pieces were loaded onto wagons. Tents were taken down. The camp that had spread across the valley for over a month disappeared within 2 days. By the morning of October 19, the Ottoman army was in full retreat southward, leaving behind burned siege equipment they couldn't transport, mass graves for their dead, and the fortress they had failed to conquer. October 19, 1552 dawned cold and grey over Eger Castle. The defenders woke to silence. No cannon fire, no drums, no shouted orders from the Ottoman lines. For men and women who had lived under constant bombing for 39 days, the silence was confusing. Scouts were sent out carefully, expecting ambush or trickery. What they found was an empty battlefield. The Ottoman camp was gone. Only debris remained. Broken ladders, thrown away equipment, trampled earth where thousands of tents had stood. The message was sent back to the castle. The siege was over. The Ottomans had pulled back. Historical accounts describe the moment when this realization spread through the garrison. There was no immediate celebration, no cheering. The survivors were too exhausted, too traumatized, too overwhelmed. Gurgely Bornemissa wrote that many people simply collapsed where they stood and cried, not from joy, but from the sudden release of unbearable tension. Eva Sisi reportedly climbed to the highest point of the eastern wall, looked out at the empty plain where the Ottoman army had been, and sank to her knees. She stayed there for nearly an hour, staring at nothing, trying to process that she had survived. István Dobó walked the walls that morning, joined by his remaining officers. He looked at the damage, shattered walls, collapsed buildings, courtyards filled with rubble and blood. According to later accounts, Dobó said very little. He simply walked, looked, and occasionally stopped to speak quietly with soldiers or civilians. Dobó understood that survival wasn't the same as victory, notes Dr. Nagy. Yes, they had held the fortress, but the cost was almost unbearable, and he carried the weight of every life lost under his command. By midday, the reality of what had happened began to settle in. Eger, a minor fortress with 2,000 defenders, had stood against a siege by 40,000 Ottoman troops. They had done what everyone said was impossible, and the news was about to spread across Europe. The immediate aftermath of the siege was grim work. The first task was caring for the wounded. Over 300 people needed medical attention, soldiers and civilians alike, suffering from everything from musket wounds to burns to injuries from falling stone. The castle's temporary hospital was overwhelmed. Civilian women, many of whom had no medical training before the siege, worked around the clock cleaning wounds, setting broken bones, and trying to prevent infection with the limited supplies available. Many of the wounded died in the days following the siege. Without antibiotics or modern surgical techniques, even relatively minor injuries could become fatal. Infections set in. Fevers spiked. People who had survived weeks of combat died in the supposed safety of the hospital. The second task was burying the dead. Final casualty figures are hard to establish with precision, but historical sources provide estimates. Of the original 800 soldiers in the garrison, about 400 were killed during the siege. Another 200 were wounded, many seriously enough that they would never return to active service. Civilian casualties were equally severe. Estimates suggest that between 200 and 300 civilians died killed by cannon fire during attacks or from disease and starvation during the siege. In total, Eger lost roughly one-third of its population. Mass graves were dug outside the castle walls. Christian burial rites were performed over hundreds of bodies at once. The graves were marked with simple wooden crosses. The human cost of Eger was staggering, says Dr. Peter. These weren't professional soldiers who had chosen military careers. Many were farmers, craftsmen, women, and children who ended up in a siege through circumstance, and they paid with their lives. The mental cost was equally severe. Modern historians recognize what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder in the accounts left by survivors. Bornemissa's writings show clear signs: intrusive memories, emotional numbness, constant alertness. He described nightmares that continued for years, flashbacks triggered by loud noises, and a deep sense of disconnection from normal life. He was not alone. Many survivors struggled to readjust to peacetime existence after living for 39 days in constant fear of death. But Eger's resistance had accomplished something beyond survival. The fortress controlled a critical pass through the northern highlands. Had it fallen, the Ottomans would have secured a direct route to the mining towns of Upper Hungary, towns that produced gold, silver, and copper, which provided important revenue to the Habsburg crown. More importantly, Eger's defense had stopped the Ottoman advance cold. Ali Pasha's failure meant that the 1552 campaign ended in stalemate rather than Ottoman victory. Sultan Suleiman's plans for further expansion into Central Europe were disrupted. Eger bought time, explains Dr. Paffy. It didn't end the Ottoman threat to Hungary that would continue for another century and a half, but it showed that Ottoman expansion could be resisted, that fortresses could hold, that the empire wasn't unbeatable. News of Eger's successful defense spread rapidly across Europe. Within weeks, reports reached Vienna, Prague, Rome, and other major cities. The story was sensational. A tiny garrison had defeated the greatest military power on earth. The propaganda value was huge. For decades, European Christians had watched the Ottomans advance, seemingly without limit. Constantinople had fallen. The Balkans had fallen. Hungary had been carved apart. The Siege of Vienna in 1529 had come terrifyingly close to success. Eger proved that resistance was possible. The mental impact of Eger can't be overstated, says Dr. Finkel. It gave hope to people who had begun to view Ottoman conquest as unavoidable. It showed that courage, preparation, and determination could overcome overwhelming odds. István Dobó was hailed as a hero throughout the Christian world. King Ferdinand I made him a noble, granting him estates and titles. The Pope sent a letter of praise. Chronicles written in the years following the siege celebrated Dobó as a Christian warrior who had stood against the infidel. Dobó himself was reportedly uncomfortable with the praise. According to later accounts, when asked about his heroism, he gave credit to his soldiers and the civilian defenders who had fought alongside them. "I did what was necessary," he reportedly said. "The people of Eger did the rest." He continued to serve as captain of Eger until 1565, overseeing the fortress's rebuilding and strengthening its defenses. He died in 1572, 20 years after the siege, and was buried with full military honors. Eva Sisi and the other women defenders became symbols of Hungarian resistance. Chronicles and poems celebrated their bravery. Later generations would remember them as the fire women of Eger, civilians who had taken up arms to defend their homeland. György Bornemissa survived the siege and later wrote the most detailed eyewitness account of the events. His chronicle, published in the late 16th century, remains the primary historical source for the siege. He lived until 1589, serving in various administrative positions. His writings suggest he never fully recovered from the trauma of the siege, but he considered his survival and his ability to document what happened a sacred duty. "These events must be remembered," he wrote in the introduction to his chronicle, "so that future generations understand the price of freedom and the courage of those who refuse to surrender it." The Siege of Eger marked a turning point in the Ottoman Habsburg struggle for control of Central Europe. Following Ali Pasha's failure, Sultan Suleiman did not authorize another major offensive into northern Hungary for several years. Ottoman strategy shifted towards strengthening control over already conquered territories rather than pushing deeper into Habsburg lands. The fortress of Eger itself was heavily rebuilt and strengthened in the decades following the siege. It remained a critical strong point on the border and was never again seriously threatened by Ottoman forces. The military lessons of Eger were studied by commanders throughout Europe. Dobó's defensive tactics, the use of earthwork reinforcements, the integration of civilian defenders, the emphasis on countermining operations, and the psychological warfare that convinced the Ottomans the garrison was stronger than it actually was, became textbook examples of effective siege defense. Eger showed that even a relatively small force could defeat a much larger attacker if properly led, well prepared, and fighting on favorable terrain, notes Colonel Purges. Those principles remain valid in military thinking today. The siege also had cultural and political effects. In Hungary, Eger became a symbol of national resistance. During periods of foreign occupation and political oppression over the following centuries, Hungarians called upon the memory of Eger as proof that their nation could survive against impossible odds. The fortress and the story of the siege became central to Hungarian national identity. In the 19th century, the novelist Gazdag Ardonyi wrote Eclipse of the Crescent Moon, a historical novel based on the siege that became one of the most beloved works in Hungarian literature. Today, Eger Castle is a national monument and museum. Thousands of visitors walk its restored walls each year, learning about the siege and the people who defended it. The Ottoman Empire, meanwhile, continued to pose a threat to Europe for another century and a half. But the momentum had shifted. After Eger, Ottoman expansion into Europe slowed. The disastrous siege of Vienna in 1683 marked the beginning of a long Ottoman retreat. By the early 18th century, the Habsburgs had reconquered most of Hungary. The empire that had seemed unstoppable in 1552 eventually collapsed entirely in the early 20th century. But in 1552, none of that could be predicted. All that mattered was that a small group of people facing destruction had refused to give up. And that refusal changed history. What makes the Siege of Eger important isn't just the military outcome. It's what the siege represented. Ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances choosing to stand and fight rather than run or surrender. The defenders of Eger weren't elite soldiers. Most were farmers, craftsmen, refugees, women who had never held a weapon before the siege, children who carried stones because there was nothing else they could do. They didn't fight for glory or conquest. They fought because the alternative, giving in, slavery, the destruction of their way of life was unacceptable. Eger is important because it reminds us that history isn't just made by kings and generals, says Dr. Peter. It's made by ordinary people in moments of crisis who decide that some things are worth fighting for even when the odds are overwhelming. The siege also shows the importance of leadership. István Dobó wasn't a brilliant tactician or a charismatic leader. He was competent, steady, and committed. He prepared his garrison. He made logical decisions under pressure. He didn't panic when the situation became desperate. And perhaps most importantly, he trusted the people under his command, including civilians and women, to rise to the occasion. That trust was rewarded. Leadership in crisis isn't about grand gestures, notes Dr. Nagy. It's about preparation, clear communication, and believing that people are capable of more than they think they are. Dobó embodied that. The Siege of Eger also offers a lesson about the limits of military power. The Ottoman Empire had every advantage: numbers, technology, experience, resources. By every logical calculation they should have won. But wars aren't fought on spreadsheets. Spirit matters. Terrain matters. Will matters. The Ottomans could surround Eger. They could bomb it, tunnel under it, attack it repeatedly, but they couldn't break the will of the people defending it. And ultimately, that made all the difference. If this story spoke to you, I need to ask a favor. Share this video. Leave a comment about what stood out to you. Was it the leadership, the civilian defenders, the impossible odds? Subscribe if you want more deep historical stories like this. And here's a question worth thinking about. If you were in Eger in 1552, knowing the odds, knowing what was coming, would you have stayed and fought? Or would you have run north to safety while you had the chance? There's no right answer. It's easy to admire heroism from a distance. It's much harder to choose it when your life is on the line. But that's exactly what 2,000 people did in the autumn of 1552. They looked at an empire, calculated the odds, and decided those odds didn't matter. They held a fortress that shouldn't have held. They defeated an army that shouldn't have been defeated. And they proved that courage, preparation, and refusal to surrender can accomplish what logic says is impossible. History remembers those who stand when standing seems pointless. The defenders of Eger stood, and 4.5 centuries later we're still telling their story. That's legacy. That's what matters. The Siege of Eger wasn't just a battle. It was a statement that freedom is worth defending. That ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things. And that the human spirit, when pushed to its limit, is more powerful than any army. In 1552, on a fortress rock in northern Hungary, 2,000 souls proved that truth, and the world has never forgotten.